Stop caring about what people think. Stoic Mindset for Freedom. You did not choose the jury, but you have been performing for it your entire life. Think about the last time you held back a thought, not because it was wrong, but because you were not sure how it would land. Think about the last time you softened your position, swallowed your instinct, not out of wisdom, but out of fear. Fear of the raised eyebrow. Fear of the silence that follows an unpopular truth. Fear of being seen as too much or not enough. That fear has a name, and it is not weakness. It is not insecurity. It is something far more specific, far more ancient, and far more curable than either of those words suggest. It is the disease of the unlived life. The Stoics watched it destroy men who commanded armies, philosophers who could dismantle an argument in 3 sentences, but could not make a single decision without consulting the invisible court of other people's approval. They named it clearly: the surrender of the ruling self to the noise of the world outside. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journal, words never intended for any reader, that the first and most necessary act of a rational being is to distinguish between what belongs to them and what does not as a philosophical exercise, as a daily survival practice. Because here is what no one tells you about the opinion of others. It is not neutral information. It is a weight, and the longer you carry it without examination, the more it reshapes your posture, your voice, your choices, and eventually, your entire sense of what is possible for you. You were not born hunched under that weight. Something taught you to pick it up. Something convinced you that carrying it was the price of belonging. And the moment you accepted that bargain, without reading the terms, without understanding what you were giving away, the performance began. This video is not here to motivate you. Motivation is temporary. This is here to do something harder and more permanent, to walk you, chamber by chamber, through the architecture of the prison you have been living in, so that by the time you reach the end, you are not inspired to be free. You simply are. The performance you never auditioned for. There is a version of you that existed before the world had opinions about you, before the first correction, before the first embarrassed look from across the room, before someone you loved made it clear without a single word that who you were in that moment was not quite right. That version of you did not perform. It simply was. Watch a child who has not yet learned to be ashamed. They sing without caring whether the notes are right. They ask questions that make adults uncomfortable without pausing to calculate the social cost. They walk into a room and take up exactly the space they need, with complete indifference to whether that space has been approved for them. They are not brave. They are simply unaware that a script exists. Then the corrections begin. Not always harshly. Sometimes the script is handed to you wrapped in love, the parent who winces when you speak too loudly, the teacher who praises your silence more than your ideas, the friend whose approval comes and goes with the reliability of weather. None of them said, "From now on, you will live for the judgment of others." The lesson was delivered in smaller doses over longer time until it became indistinguishable from instinct. Epictetus, born into literal slavery and one of the most unshakable minds in recorded history, understood this mechanism with painful precision. In his discourses, he wrote that men are disturbed not by the things that happen to them, but by their opinions about those things. He did not mean this as comfort. He meant it as a diagnosis. The chains that hold most people are not forged from circumstance. They are forged from interpretation, from the story attached to every glance, every silence, every moment of perceived rejection. The script you are performing today was written in those stories, and here is what makes it so difficult to see. The script is not entirely wrong. The ability to read a room, to calibrate your communication, to understand the impact of your words, these are marks of intelligence and care. The problem is not that the script exists. The problem is that you have forgotten you are reading it. You have confused the role with the person. You have mistaken the performance for the life. Marcus Aurelius governed the most powerful empire on earth. He played the required roles when necessary. But in his meditations, he returned relentlessly to a single practice, the stripping away of every external role until only the rational self remained. Not the emperor, not the symbol. The man, accountable to his own standard and no one else's. What you are carrying is not your identity. It is a role assigned before you were old enough to negotiate the terms. And the most important question this video will ask is not who do others think you are. It is this: who were you before you learned to answer that question? That person did not disappear. They are simply waiting, beneath the performance, for the moment you stop auditioning for a role you never chose. The debt you never agreed to pay. Every performance has a price, and the currency in which most people pay it is not time or energy, although it costs both. The currency is something more intimate, the slow, steady installment of the self. Piece by piece, choice by choice, silence by silence. This is the debt, and you never signed the contract. Approval seeking is almost never about vanity. That is the misdiagnosis that keeps people stuck. The belief that needing validation is a character flaw. But shame is not a cure for this. Shame is precisely the mechanism that keeps the debt alive. The moment you feel ashamed of needing approval, you seek approval for how well you are hiding your need for it. The loop closes. The debt compounds. At its root, the need for external validation is about belonging. It is about the primal biological terror of exclusion. The ancient understanding that to be cast out from the group was not a social inconvenience. It was death. Your nervous system has not forgotten that. So the debt was never irrational. It was survival logic, internalized so early, it bypassed conscious consent entirely. Seneca saw this with the clarity of someone who had lived inside the trap himself. He spent decades performing for an audience he privately despised. The imperial court of Nero, where approval was the only currency that kept you alive. In his letters, he wrote with urgency, "Reclaim yourself, and gather and save the time which till lately has been forced from you, or filched away, or has merely slipped from your hands." He was not talking about time management, he was naming the debt. Here is the transaction at its center, stated plainly. Every time you modify who you are to secure someone else's approval, you are making a payment. You exchange a piece of authentic response for a unit of temporary acceptance. The acceptance arrives. It feels like relief. Then it expires. Because it always expires. And the anxiety returns, slightly larger than before, demanding another payment. This is not a relationship. It is a subscription you never chose and cannot seem to cancel. The tragedy is not that the payments are large. Often they are small, a withheld opinion, a laughed-off wound, a dream mentioned so casually it could be mistaken for a joke. These micropayments are so habitual they no longer feel like choices. But they accumulate with the quiet, devastating consistency of interest on a debt you did not know you were carrying. Marcus Aurelius conducted a daily audit with a single question: am I doing this because it is right, or because I fear what happens if I do not? Two actions can look identical from the outside. One is chosen. One is extorted. The difference between them is the entire distance between a free life and a performed one. The debt is not real. It was never real. It was always a story told to a child who had no framework yet to call it fiction. When the armor became the prison, there was a moment, you will not remember it precisely, when you decided that the safest version of yourself was also the most acceptable one, not the most honest, not the most alive, the most acceptable. And so you began, with the quiet ingenuity of a vulnerable person under pressure, to construct a version of yourself that could survive the room. You built it carefully. It worked. That is the part no one wants to examine, because it complicates the narrative. The mask was not a mistake. The people-pleasing was not stupidity. At the moment it was constructed, it was the most rational response available to the information you had. You were not wrong to build it. But you built it for a version of your life that no longer exists. The child who needed to be invisible to avoid the anger in the room is not in that room anymore. The circumstances changed. The construction did not. Epictetus described men who had achieved every external marker of freedom: wealth, status, the absence of physical constraint. yet remained internally enslaved because they had never examined the beliefs governing them from the inside. The chains that are invisible are the most difficult to remove, he said, precisely because the prisoner has forgotten they exist and begun to call them character. The armor has a specific quality that makes it uniquely difficult to remove. It feels like you. After enough years of wearing it, the weight becomes familiar. The restriction becomes normal. You stop noticing where your actual self ends and the constructed self begins, because the constructed self has been present so long it has accumulated its own reflexes. It responds before you can choose. It speaks before you can think. And here is the moment of genuine discomfort this chapter cannot avoid. The armor is not protecting you from the world anymore. It is protecting the world from you. It is keeping your actual voice, your actual needs, your actual presence, safely contained where they cannot disturb anyone, cannot risk rejection, cannot expose you to the terror of being fully seen and found insufficient. Marcus Aurelius asked himself directly, do you know who is actually living your life? Is it the rational, sovereign interior self? Or is it the construction, the armor wearing the shape of a person, moving through the world on behalf of a fear that should have retired years ago? The armor was built for a battle that ended. The war is over. What remains is you, still armored, still guarding a perimeter around a wound that has healed, or could heal, if you allowed it the exposure it needs. Taking it off is not a single dramatic act. It happens in small, specific choices. The opinion stated without apology, the boundary held without excessive explanation, the need expressed without the performance of not having it. It happens in the gap between the armor's first instinct and the moment you choose differently. The tyranny of the imagined crowd. Close your eyes and locate the audience. You know the one. The group of observers present at every significant decision, every social interaction, every private moment of failure or ambition. The ones whose imagined reaction shapes what you say before you say it, what you allow yourself to want before you permit the wanting to become real. Now ask yourself, who specifically are they? Name them. Put faces to the crowd. You will find, if you press this with genuine honesty, that the crowd is surprisingly small. Sometimes it is 3 people. Sometimes it is 1. Sometimes it is a composite, assembled from fragments of a parent, a former teacher, an early rejection, a cultural standard absorbed so completely it has taken on the quality of a person. And sometimes, this is the discovery that changes everything. The crowd is entirely imaginary, not metaphorically, literally. The people you have been performing for are not watching. They are occupied entirely with the management of their own invisible audience, with no sustained attention left to direct at you. Marcus Aurelius addressed this directly. Very little is needed to make a happy life, he wrote. And the chief obstacle to that little is the assumption that others are thinking about us at all. Think about the last time you did something embarrassing in public. How much mental energy did you spend replaying it, reconstructing the expressions of the witnesses? Now ask, how much time did those witnesses spend thinking about it? Almost none, because they were generating their own private catastrophes, spending their own mental energy on their own audiences. The audience is not watching you. The audience is performing for its own audience in an infinite regression of self-consciousness with no actual observer at the center. Epictetus put it plainly, if someone despises you, that is his problem. Your problem is only whether you have acted according to your own nature. The opinion exists in the person holding it. It does not exist in you. And a thing that does not exist in you cannot harm you unless you reach out, take it from them and press it against yourself. You have been pressing it against yourself your entire life. But there is a layer beneath this that is even more unsettling. Even when the audience is real, even when specific people are genuinely forming judgments, those judgments are not about you. They are about the version of you that fits inside their framework, assembled from their own history, their own wounds, their own invisible crowd. It has your name on it, but it was never a portrait. It was always a mirror. The crowd was never there in the way you imagined. You have been paying rent on a prison built from the opinions of people who were not watching. The sovereignty you were born with and forgot. There is a court that has been in session your entire life. It convenes without announcement, operates continuously, and delivers verdicts with remarkable consistency. And in all the years it has been running, there is one witness who has never once been called to the stand. You, not the performing version, the interior witness, the one who was present for everything, who saw what you did when no one was watching, who knows the exact distance between who you are in public and who you are at 3 in the morning when the performance has nowhere left to go. This is the voice that speaks after the applause has died, the one that remains when the validation arrives, and somehow does not fill the space you expected it to fill. You got the approval. The audience responded exactly as you needed. And something in you sat quietly in the aftermath and said, "But that was not really you up there." Marcus Aurelius understood this as the foundational discipline of the examined life. The first task of a rational being, he wrote, is to examine the governing faculty, to look directly at what is actually directing the choices beneath every surface interaction, not to judge it harshly. Simply to see it with honesty, because a thing seen clearly can be worked with, and a thing kept in darkness governs without accountability. Here is the paradox at the center of approval seeking that almost no one identifies correctly. The person who lives entirely for external validation is not someone with too much self-focus. They are someone with almost no genuine self-relationship at all. The constant outward orientation, the perpetual scanning of rooms for signals, is not evidence of caring too much about themselves. It is evidence of having outsourced self-assessment so completely that they have lost the internal infrastructure to perform it independently. You do not actually know what you think about yourself. You know what you think others think about you. These have never been the same thing. Seneca addressed this in his letters. Choose someone whose life and speech have satisfied you, he wrote, and picture them as your pattern. The purpose is not to find someone who tells you that you are adequate. It is to develop the internal clarity to assess your own adequacy without requiring external confirmation. The standard must eventually become yours. Every time you override your own perception to accommodate someone else's, you are telling the interior witness that its testimony does not matter. Every time you perform a version of yourself you privately know is not accurate, you are widening the distance between the person who shows up in public and the person who exists in private. And every time you seek approval from outside to fill a space that only internal self-respect can fill, you are confirming to yourself that you are not a reliable authority on your own life. The approval cannot fix this. It cannot reach that deep. It lands on the surface and dissipates because the wound it is being used to treat is not a surface wound. It is a wound in the relationship between you and your own judgment. The interior witness does not need you to be perfect. It asks for something far more modest and far more difficult, to be consulted, to be included in the proceedings of your own life, to be called to the stand after all the years of sitting in the gallery watching others deliver verdicts about you. Reason as the blade that cuts illusion. There is a specific kind of discomfort that has nothing to do with pain. It is not sharp. It does not announce itself with urgency. It arrives quietly, in the spaces between things, between the end of one task and the beginning of another, in the 3 seconds of stillness before you reach, by reflex, for the phone. It is the discomfort of your own company. The speed with which modern life allows you to escape it has made it one of the most avoided experiences in contemporary existence. Not because it is unbearable, it is not, but because it has become unfamiliar. The infrastructure of distraction is so comprehensive, so permanently available, that the experience of simply being present with your own interior has become something many people have not voluntarily chosen in years. This is not an accident. The notification, the metric, the visible count of who responded and how, these are not neutral tools. They are approval delivery mechanisms engineered to intercept exactly the moment when you might otherwise have sat with yourself and found out what was actually there. Blaise Pascal, writing in the 17th century without any knowledge of smartphones, identified the mechanism with uncomfortable accuracy. All of humanity's problems, he wrote, stem from the inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He meant it as a precise causal observation that the flight from stillness is the primary mechanism by which human beings avoid the interior confrontation that genuine self-knowledge requires. The Stoics built their entire practice around refusing that flight. Marcus Aurelius began each morning with deliberate interior examination, not planning, not optimizing, but simply looking, asking what the day required of his character, noting where he had fallen short the previous day without either excusing it or catastrophizing it, using that honest inventory as the foundation for conscious choice rather than reactive performance. This practice has a name in Stoic philosophy, prosoche, attention to oneself, not self-absorption, but genuine, patient, honest attention to the interior. The deliberate cultivation of self-awareness as a daily discipline, practiced not because it feels good, but because a life without it is a life governed by forces that have never been examined. The reason most people do not do this is not laziness. It is that when you first stop running and sit still, what surfaces is not peace. What surfaces is everything you have been moving fast enough to stay ahead of. The unprocessed grief. The anxiety with no clean object. The questions you have been declining to ask because you are not certain you will welcome the answers. This is why the practice feels threatening. Not because stillness is dangerous, but because what it reveals has been under pressure for a long time. Epictetus described the essential skill as the capacity to distinguish between what is happening and what you are telling yourself about what is happening. The discomfort that surfaces in stillness is not the problem. It is information. It is the interior witness delivering its testimony. And that testimony, however uncomfortable, is the most accurate data you have about the actual condition of your interior life. Start with 3 minutes, not as a wellness protocol, simply as an act of presence, a deliberate choice to be in your own company without escape, without agenda. Notice what surfaces. Do not evaluate it. Do not immediately problem solve it. Simply observe it with the patient, non-reactive attention that Marcus Aurelius brought to his morning inventory. What you are building in those 3 minutes is not a habit. It is a faculty. The faculty of self-witnessing, of being genuinely present to your own interior experience without needing to perform, escape, or manage it. A faculty that makes everything that follows not just intellectually comprehensible, but practically possible. The weight of unlived lives judging yours. There are 2 voices. You have always known this even if you have never named it directly. One speaks first, quickly, with practiced fluency. It knows the room, knows the audience, knows exactly what configuration of words and tone will produce the desired response. It is efficient, socially intelligent, refined through years of careful calibration. It operates with the smooth automaticity of something rehearsed so many times it no longer feels like rehearsal. The other voice speaks later, quieter, often after the room has emptied and the performance has concluded and there is nothing left to manage. It speaks in the register of a person talking to themselves when certain no one is listening. And what it says is frequently, uncomfortably, at odds with what the first voice said out loud. This is not hypocrisy. It is the predictable result of a system optimized for external approval rather than internal coherence. The first voice is the system's output. The second voice is the self's actual position, present before the optimization began, continuing beneath it, quietly keeping the record of every moment the performance diverged from the truth. The Stoics called the faculty the second voice speaks from the hegemonikon, the governing part of the soul, the seat of rational judgment and authentic response. Everything else in the practice, the management of impressions, the cultivation of equanimity, depends entirely on first establishing contact with this faculty. You cannot govern a ship from a position on the dock. You must be aboard. Most people are living from the dock. The governing faculty has been displaced from its rightful position and replaced by the approval management system, not through a single dramatic abdication, but through the accumulation of small choices to defer to external judgment rather than internal conviction. The result is a particular exhaustion that sleep does not fix. Not the exhaustion of too much activity, but the exhaustion of sustained inauthenticity, the energy cost of continuously maintaining a gap between what you actually think and what you say, between who you actually are and who you are presenting yourself to be. This exhaustion is data. It is the second voice registering, at the level of the body itself, the cost of being continuously overridden. Learning to speak from the second voice is not about becoming confrontational or less considerate. The Stoics were among the most socially conscientious philosophers in history. What they advocated was the correct ordering of internal authority, the insistence that the governing faculty remain the actual governor, that social intelligence serve the self rather than replace it. The word is continuity. The practice is not about becoming louder or less accommodating. It is about developing continuity between interior and exterior, integrity in the architectural sense, the quality of a structure that is the same all the way through, that does not have a load-bearing exterior and a hollow center. The second voice already knows what it needs to say. It has been composing the statement for years in the quiet hours, in the specific ache of moments when you said yes and meant no. It does not need to be created. It needs to be authorized. Authorization begins with a commitment so small it sounds trivial, and is in practice one of the most demanding things you will attempt. The next time the first voice moves to speak, pause. One breath, long enough to ask the second voice what it actually thinks. In that pause, the self is no longer entirely displaced. It is present. It is consulted. It has been, for one moment, treated as the authority it actually is. The discipline of dying to the audience daily. Somewhere, at some point, you received the message. It did not arrive as a formal declaration. It came through the specific quality of a silence that followed something you said. Through the slight shift in a parent's expression, when your enthusiasm exceeded what the room could hold. Through the withdrawal of attention that coincided precisely with a moment of genuine, unguarded self-expression. The message was this: you are too much, too loud, too sensitive, too intense, too emotional, to yourself. The specific adjective varied, but the underlying instruction was consistent. Reduce, compress. Make yourself more manageable for the people whose approval you depend on. And you believed it. Of course you believed it. You were young, and the people delivering the message held all the authority, and the human need for belonging is not a preference. It is a survival imperative, encoded in the deepest layers of the nervous system by millions of years of evolution, in a species that could not survive alone. When belonging is threatened, the organism adapts. It reduces. It makes itself fit. The adaptation was intelligent. It was the correct response to the conditions present at the time. The people who delivered the message were, in most cases, not delivering it maliciously. They were passing forward the same inherited instruction they had received, compressing you in the same ways they had been compressed. Understanding this does not erase the impact, but it does something more practically useful. It removes the message from the category of truth and places it correctly in the category of history. It had an author, and what has an author is not a law. It is a document. Documents can be reread with new eyes. Their authority is not permanent. Epictetus made this distinction with the bluntness of a man who had been a slave, and understood the difference between conditions that actually constrain and conditions that only appear to. Some things are in our power and some are not. Whether you continue to ratify the message, whether you take it from the historical record and install it as a permanent feature of your self-concept, that is entirely within your power. Marcus Aurelius returned repeatedly to Katafusan, living according to what one actually is rather than what the surrounding environment demanded one become. To compress oneself below one's nature, to perform a reduced version of it continuously. In the Stoic framework, this is the primary mechanism of an unlived life. The myth of too much rests on a structurally false premise, that your fullness necessarily reduces what is available for others. That your presence is a cost rather than a contribution. This can be tested directly. The relationships in your life that have felt most alive, examine them. What they have in common is not the strategic reduction of one person for the comfort of another. They have the opposite. Two people actually showing up, actually taking their space, actually bringing their full and unperformed selves into contact with each other. Genuine connection does not require your compression. It requires your presence. The people who responded to your fullness with discomfort were not showing you the limit of what you could safely be. They were showing you the limit of what they could receive. Those are not the same boundary. They were never the same boundary. You are not too much. You were too much for specific people in specific circumstances operating under their own specific limitations. The instruction to compress yourself was not issued by reality. It was issued by individuals. And individuals, unlike reality, can be mistaken. Amor Fati, loving what cannot be controlled. There is a particular fantasy that accompanies the realization that you have been living compressed. It looks something like this: a single decisive moment of transformation, a dramatic reclamation, a grand act of self-assertion that announces to everyone who has benefited from your smallness that the arrangement is over. The fantasy is understandable. It is also counterproductive. The compression did not happen in a single moment. It happened incrementally, through the accumulation of small adjustments, each individually reasonable, collectively constituting a significant reduction of the original self. The restoration follows the same logic. Not a dramatic rupture, but a patient, deliberate, largely invisible process of reclaiming territory one decision at a time. The Stoics had a concept for this: Amor Fati, love of fate, not passive resignation, but the active embrace of what actually is, including what actually was, as the only honest foundation from which to build what comes next. You cannot reclaim a self you have not first accepted. And acceptance does not mean approval. It means clear-eyed acknowledgement. This happened. This is where I am. This is what I am working with. What makes this difficult is the grief. And the grief must be named because skipping it produces a reclamation that is performed rather than real. There is something genuinely lost in years of compression. Experiences not had, connections not made, work not done, versions of yourself that existed only in the gap between what you expressed and what you felt. That loss is real. It deserves acknowledgement before it is set aside. But grief, when it is fully felt rather than managed, does not produce paralysis. It produces clarity, the specific clarity of a person who knows precisely what they are reclaiming and why, not because a video told them to, not because a framework made it sound appealing, but because the cost of continuing has finally become more legible than the cost of changing. Marcus Aurelius returned to a single discipline when confronted with circumstances beyond his control. Distinguish with absolute precision between what can be influenced and what cannot. Apply full effort to the former, and practice complete release of the latter, not as a spiritual bypass, as a structural feature of effective action. Energy directed at what cannot be changed is not just wasted. It is actively counterproductive because it consumes the resources needed for what can be changed. The approval of specific people who required your compression to feel comfortable around you cannot be changed. The years already spent in the performance cannot be changed. The specific experiences of compression, the moments of compression's cost, cannot be changed. What can be changed is the next choice, and the one after that. Seneca wrote in his letters that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. The anticipation of the cost of change, the imagined disapproval, the imagined loss of acceptance, the imagined exposure of the actual self to the actual judgment of actual people, is, for most people, considerably more painful than the reality of those things when they actually occur. The performance continues largely in service of a threat that has been catastrophically overestimated. This is testable. In the small experiments of incremental reclamation, the opinion stated, the boundary held, the genuine response given where a managed one had previously been automatic. What most people discover is that the consequences they feared either do not materialize at all, or materialize in forms far less devastating than anticipated. The room does not collapse. The relationships that matter do not dissolve. Some that were built entirely on the performance do reconfigure, and some of those reconfigurations are painful. But painful and catastrophic are not synonyms. The next chapter does not ask you to make the large move. It asks you to locate the smallest available one, the single decision closest to the surface. requiring the least dramatic departure from the current state, that is nevertheless genuinely chosen rather than performed. That decision is the beginning, not the middle, not the end. The beginning, taken seriously, is enough. The self that was waiting. There is something that survives the compression. This matters more than it might initially appear to, because one of the quieter fears underneath the work of reclamation is that there might not be anything left to reclaim, that the performance has been running so long that beneath the management and the approval seeking, there is no one in particular waiting to be found. This fear is understandable. It is also unfounded. The self does not dissolve under pressure. It goes quiet. It withdraws to a depth the compression cannot reach, and it waits there with a patience that has no deadline. It does not announce its presence or demand recognition. It simply remains, present in the specific dissatisfactions that accumulate when the performance diverges from the truth, audible in the second voice that speaks in the aftermath of rooms, visible in the particular aliveness that surfaces in moments when the management briefly drops and something genuine moves through without being intercepted. You have felt this. Everyone who has lived with the performance long enough has felt it. The specific quality of a moment when the guard came down, when something true was said or done, and the response from the interior was not relief exactly, but recognition. A sense of, that is it. That is the thing that was being kept back. The Stoics called the essential self, the daemon, the indwelling rational principle that constitutes what a person most fundamentally is. Marcus Aurelius returned to this concept throughout the Meditations. Tend to the inner daemon. Give it the honor it deserves. Do not neglect it. Do not override it. Do not substitute the demands of the exterior for its actual requirements. The daemon has requirements. The self that emerges from compression does not simply expand into its natural shape automatically, the way a spring decompresses when the weight is removed. It has been shaped by the pressure. It has learned to expect the weight. When the weight is removed, it requires something active. Not just the absence of suppression, but the presence of conditions in which genuine selfhood can be exercised, expressed, and gradually trusted. Those conditions share a common structure. The first is honesty, not the performance of transparency, but the actual practice of saying what is true even when it is inconvenient or unwelcome. The essential self requires the practice itself, the continuous small exercise of letting the interior position and the exterior expression be the same thing. The second is engagement with what actually matters to you, not what should matter, not what would be impressive to care about, but what you, in the privacy of your own governing faculty, actually find worth your time. Epictetus was direct. The person who does not know what they actually want will always be at the mercy of what others want from them. The third is tolerance for the discomfort of being seen. Not sought, not performed, simply tolerated. The experience of being present in a room as yourself, visible as yourself, without the protective layer of the managed exterior between you and whatever judgment the room might render. This tolerance has to be built gradually, and the process is uncomfortable in a way that feels indistinguishable from danger until enough experience has accumulated to teach the nervous system the difference. Seneca recommended something quiet and sustainable, the internal work done consistently without audience, until the interior and the exterior are continuous enough that the distinction stops being an active management project and becomes simply how one moves through the world. The self that was not waiting to be spectacular. It was not waiting to finally say everything it had been holding back. It was waiting for something considerably more modest and considerably more profound. It was waiting to be the one making the decisions, making it sustainable. Every insight has a half-life. This is one of the most important and least discussed facts about genuine psychological change, and ignoring it is responsible for most of the failure that follows genuine breakthrough. The moment of recognition carries its own energy. It feels like momentum. It feels sometimes like the hard part is over. Surely the doing will follow naturally from here. It does not, or rather it does for a while. And then the conditions that produced the insight recede. Ordinary life reasserts itself, and the pattern that seemed so clearly dismantled begins, quietly, to reassemble. Not because the insight was false, because insight without structure is a single event rather than a practice. And what is needed is not an event. What is needed is a practice. The Stoics were, above all else, architects of practice. They were not primarily interested in the correct philosophical position. They were interested in what a person actually does, in an ordinary day, to maintain contact with what they know to be true, when the conditions of ordinary life are continuously working to erode that contact. Marcus Aurelius did not write the meditations to publish them. He wrote them to himself as a daily practice of return, reminding, reconnecting, re-anchoring to the principles he had committed to, because he understood that the governing faculty requires continuous maintenance. The Emperor of Rome needed a daily writing practice to keep himself honest with himself. The lesson is not that you need to be emperor to face this challenge. The lesson is that the challenge is universal, and the solution is structural. Structure means, first, regularity over intensity. The approval management system operates continuously. The practice that counters it must also be continuous, not in the sense of constant conscious effort, but in the sense of recurring contact with the governing faculty, built into the architecture of the day deliberately enough that it happens even when motivation is low. For the specific work of reclaiming the self from approval-seeking, the practice has a particular focus: the daily examination of the gap. Where today was the distance between the interior position and the exterior expression? Where did the first voice speak before the second voice was consulted? Not as self-condemnation, as data. Seneca recommended the evening review, a brief, honest accounting of the day's significant moments, not a performance of self-improvement. An actual audit. Where did I live according to my actual values today? And where did I live according to the anxiety of external judgment? The answer, taken honestly over time, becomes the most accurate map available of where the work most urgently needs to go. The second structural element is the relationship chosen for honesty, the specific one or two people with whom the performance can be laid down, not occasionally, but habitually, where the second voice is the normal register of conversation. Epictetus was emphatic. The company you keep is not a peripheral feature of the philosophical life. It is a central one. If every relationship requires the performance becomes the only available model for how to be a person. The third element is the commitment to asymmetry. The approval management system is fast and fluent and has decades of practice. The developing capacity for authentic self-governance is slower and less certain, and will lose a significant percentage of the early encounters. Sustainability requires accepting this without treating it as evidence of failure. Actual change is nonlinear. It proceeds through accumulation rather than breakthrough. The measure of progress is not the absence of the old pattern. It is the shortening of the interval between the pattern and the recognition. The gradual acceleration of the moment when the governing faculty catches up to what just happened and names it clearly, so that the next encounter can go differently. Over time, with structure, the interval shortens. The second voice begins to speak before the performance has fully deployed, then during it, then, with sufficient practice, before it begins. That is the destination, not perfection. The correct ordering of the voices, the second voice governing, the first voice serving, the self that was waiting finally quietly in charge. The ordinary life, fully inhabited. It does not look the way the fantasy promised. The fantasy was part of the problem, another image of an idealized self projected into an imagined future, another way of locating the real life somewhere other than where you are standing right now. The fantasy promised arrival, a moment, a threshold, a before and after. The reality is quieter, more continuous, and in the ways that actually matter, considerably better. What it looks like is this: an ordinary Tuesday. The same obligations, the same relationships, the same recurring friction of a life lived among other people. Nothing externally transformed. And yet something in the quality of engagement with all of it is different. Not dramatically, not legible to someone observing from the outside, but unmistakable from the inside, where the difference between inhabiting a life and managing it is felt continuously and precisely. The inhabited life is not a life without approval seeking. It is a life in which approval seeking has been returned to its appropriate scale. There is nothing wrong with caring what people think. There is nothing wrong with wanting to be liked or recognized. These become pathological only when installed as the governing principle, when the need for approval becomes the lens through which every decision is filtered, every self-expression pre-censored. What changes is the position of approval seeking in the hierarchy. It moves from the governing faculty to somewhere more like an advisory function. It can still speak. Its information is sometimes genuinely useful. The problem was never that it existed. The problem was that it was in charge. Marcus Aurelius described the correct ordering with a metaphor that has stayed in the philosophical tradition for 2,000 years: the inner citadel. The governing faculty as a fortress that external pressures can surround but cannot, if properly maintained, penetrate and occupy. Not invulnerable, not indifferent, but sovereign, making its own decisions from its own center, rather than being governed by the continuous pressure of what the surrounding world appears to require. The person living from the inner citadel is not difficult. This is a misunderstanding worth correcting, because one of the fears underneath the work of reclamation is that authenticity will make you harder to be around. This is not what the work produces when done with integrity. What it produces is ease. The person not continuously managing the gap between what they feel and what they express has available a quality of presence that the managed person cannot access, because the managed person's attention is always partially occupied by the management. Relationships from this place have a different texture. Some relationships were structured around the performance, and those will require renegotiation or will not survive. And this is a real cost deserving acknowledgement. But the relationships capable of meeting the actual self deepen in a way that was not available when the performance was running. Genuine connection requires genuine presence, and genuine presence is precisely what the performance was designed to prevent. Seneca wrote in one of his letters that the help we can offer each other is contingent on our honesty with each other, and our honesty with each other is contingent on our honesty with ourselves. The compressed self cannot offer genuine connection because it is not genuinely present. What it offers is a service, and services, however skilled, are not the same as presence. The ordinary life, fully inhabited, is one in which you are present. Present in the conversation happening now rather than the conversation being managed. Present in the relationship as it actually is. Present in the work with the quality of engagement available only to someone who has chosen it. Present, finally, in the private interior of your own experience. The thoughts you actually think, the feelings you actually have, the values you actually hold. Epictetus ended his Enchiridion with words that have the quality of something earned. Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life. Translated plainly, stop spending your life trying to arrange the external world into a configuration that will finally feel safe enough to be yourself in. The external world will not arrive at that configuration. The safety you are looking for cannot be located out there. It is available only from inside the citadel, from the self that has been examined and known and accepted and chosen, repeatedly, in ordinary moments, as the actual basis of the actual life. Living the examined life without making it a performance. There is a particular irony that waits at the end of this kind of work, and it is precise enough to deserve its own chapter. It is this: the work of becoming authentic can itself become a performance. The person who has done the reading, internalized the framework, developed the vocabulary of self-examination, has access to a new and more sophisticated version of the old problem. Instead of performing competence or likability, they begin performing self-awareness. Instead of managing the impression of having it together, they manage the impression of having done the work. The performance does not disappear, it upgrades. This is not a reason to distrust the work, it is a reason to extend it in a specific direction, toward the capacity to examine the examination itself. The question is not only where am I still performing for external approval, but also, is the way I am pursuing authenticity itself a performance? Socrates did not understand know thyself as a destination. He understood it as a permanent condition of inquiry, an ongoing activity with no terminal point, no moment at which the examination concludes and the examined life begins. The Stoics inherited this directly. Marcus Aurelius did not write the Meditations as a record of someone who had arrived. He wrote them as evidence of someone who was continuously, daily, without expectation of completion, returning to the work. The work was the point. This matters because the performance version is always organized around an outcome, a state to be achieved, a transformation to be completed, and then displayed. The genuine version has no such organization. It is simply moving, examining, adjusting, noticing, returning, with the understanding that the governing faculty requires continuous engagement because the conditions it is engaging with are continuously changing. You will change. The pressures that shape the original compression will evolve, and new pressures will arrive. The approval management system will adapt. It is intelligent and flexible, and deeply committed to its own survival. It will find new territories to operate in as the old ones are reclaimed. The work of the examined life is therefore not a finite project. It is a permanent orientation. Epictetus addressed the danger of philosophical performance directly. The person who reads the Stoics and then goes out to display their stoicism has missed the point entirely. Philosophy is not something you carry in front of you. It is something you carry inside you, and its presence is visible, not in the vocabulary you use to describe yourself, but in the quality of your actual responses to actual events. The test is not the seminar. It is the difficult conversation, the unexpected loss, the moment when something you wanted is taken away, and what the governing faculty does in that moment, without preparation, without audience. This is the most honest measure of how far the work has actually gone. Progress is measured not in the quality of insight, but in the compression of time, the narrowing interval between the automatic response and the examined one. Early in the work, the examination arrives hours after the event. Later, it arrives during the event. Later still, it begins to arrive before, a brief pause in which the governing faculty inserts itself between the stimulus and the response and asks quietly, "What do I actually think about this?" That question is the entire practice in miniature. The examined life does not look examined from the outside. The person living it is not visibly reflective or conspicuously deliberate. They are simply present, responsive rather than reactive, honest without performance, capable of the full range of human engagement without the flatness that accompanies a life lived predominantly in the managed register. They laugh when something is actually funny. They disagree when they actually disagree. They say they do not know when they do not know, and they say they were wrong when they were wrong. They say what they want with the directness available only to someone who has stopped being afraid that wanting things is itself a vulnerability to be concealed. They are, in the plainest sense, there. And in being there, fully, consistently, without the reservation that the performance requires, they make it possible for the people around them to be there too. The person who has stopped performing gives others something more valuable than any performance could offer. They give them a person to actually be with, which was, underneath everything, what everyone was looking for all along.